I'd like to invite Mr. Gautam Kumra, Managing Partner, McKinsey and Company, India, to talk about leading for the long term.
Good morning. Well, firstly, thank you, Mahendra, for inviting me to share some thoughts. And you raised the concern of short-termism, and I'm going to dwell on that. But before raising the concern, I think I'd like to start with a hope. And I'll talk to you about a brief incident. It actually happened yesterday. I was in Mumbai and I met a young 27-year-old entrepreneur who was talking to me about his fascinating startup idea. And in the course of the conversation, he said, my principles are, I have this 5P principle for how I'm building my startup. And it got my interest. I said, tell me about the 5Ps. So he said, first is purpose. Second, he said, is passion. Third, he said, is product. Fourth, he said, was people. And fifth, he said, was profit. And it struck me. I said, here's a 27-year-old guy who put profit as the fifth one. And he told me, he made a point to me and said, the order is very important. And the reason I thought that was inspiring to me is because we are a young nation. I think 60-70% of the population is them, not many of us on the stage. So that gave me a ray of hope. The second thing that I think should give us a ray of hope is the complexion of the Indian economy and how it's going to unfold over the next 15 years. You see, if you look at today, we are a $2.8 trillion economy, and if we have to get to, see, an $8 to $10 trillion economy by 2030, the number of large companies in this country, and I define large as, let's say, more than $500 million. Today we have about 500 $500 million plus companies in the country, and by about 2030 we need about 1,500. And if you do the math, over 10 years, roughly half of the current ones won't exist. So if you move forward to 2030, 80% of the large companies in India at that time are not existing today. So if we seed these ideas now, I think we have the reason to be optimistic that with young leaders and with many new companies to be born, which, by the way, collectively will represent about 2/3 of India's GDP, I think it's absolutely the right time for us to be not only talking about the concerns, but also some of the ideas to address those concerns. Concerns, I'm going to skip a few slides, Mahendra, in the interest of making up some time. Wake-up call, you have made the point, but McKinsey, we have to have some data, so I'll share some data. But I think it's fair to say that 87% of the executives today, and I'm going to talk more, you talked about more from a board standpoint. I'm going to make most of my comments from a CEO and a management standpoint. I think it's fair to say that 87% of the executives around the world feel the pressure, right, to demonstrate financial results within 2 years. In fact, 40% or so or more actually feel the pressure to do so within a year. Now, the reason this is strange is, I'll come back and talk about this later, but 70% of the value of any company comes from cash flows and earnings that are 3 to 6 years out. So think about the contrast. You're preoccupied with next year, where majority of the value is 3, 6, 7 years out. What's driving that? Many things drive that, but one of them actually has to do with investor expectations. If you look at the average shareholding on the New York Stock Exchange as of anybody holding a stock in a company has gone down from 9.5 years in 1960 to 2.2 years in 1990 to as little as 4 months today. About 40% of the trading these days is being done by what we call micro investors, who are basically going and trying to optimize seconds. And 40% of that is actually being driven by micro investors. You look at you talked about this, Mahendra, the average lifespan of a company, right, in the Fortune, rather in the S&P 500 has gone down from 90 years to now 15 years. So over the next decade, half of the companies that exist today will not exist. Further, if you look at the CEO lifespan, what's interesting is not the global figures. I think we all know that the global figures have been coming down. I came across this piece of research that I still have to fully comprehend, to be honest, but I was surprised that the average CEO tenure, even in India, has come down to as little as 4 years. You know, since the beginning of this year, I was told that 60 CEOs of BSE 500 companies have changed hands. Now, some of them may be retirement, some of them may be public sector institutions, natural things happening, but still, I think you cannot ignore the fact that the volatility and the short-term concerns and the performance expectations are also beginning to weigh on executives in this market. It is not just a Western market phenomenon. If you talk to CEOs and CFOs here in this case, more than half of the CFOs will tell you that they would actually defer or deprioritize on strong NPV investment to meet short-term earnings pressures, right? And I think particularly as we're going through a period of slowdown, you can imagine how the kinds of issues, trade-offs that CFOs and CEOs are having to make. When you ask them, again, this is our survey, you see 44% of senior executives use less than 3-year time horizon in terms of setting their strategy. But 73% of them say that, frankly, having a time horizon of more than 3 years would be better. They should be using more than a 3-year time frame. And 86% of them agree, right, that long-term decision-making framework would actually improve performance. Right? One of the reasons, by the way, again, I think I'm a bit more optimistic, is in this market there is still a large chunk of companies owned by owners and founders who inherently, I think, as opposed to some of the professional management elsewhere in the world, still have more long-term orientation. So I think we have a reason to be hopeful there. So as Mahendra said, is therefore capitalism all dead, right? Because today, if you look at the world, we are consuming 1.5 times the world's resources than what's available. You know, there's more than 1 billion people who go hungry at night before they go to bed. You know, 100 people in this world have accumulated more wealth than 3.5 billion people in this world. So is this capitalism really sustainable? I think that's the question that has been asked, will be asked, and I think any system where a majority of the people do not feel like they are being brought along will ultimately crash. And I think that's no surprise. That's partly what's resulting in such high degree of protectionism and trade barriers being erected around the world. Answer, I don't think, is to give up on capitalism. I think capitalism has served us well in many ways. Look at the number of people who've been brought out of the poverty. Look at even in China. I think a wonderful example, and hopefully what we can do in India and continue to do in India over the next many decades. But I think it needs to evolve. And I think Shamik talked about the key word, and I'll hit on that. I think it's really about being purpose-driven and being focused on the long term. And I think it is not to give up capitalism, but I think it is redefine the mindset with which we pursue capitalism. So you see a 2x2 here, right? Profit and purpose. I think, and I think this dialogue has been going around the world. But if you think of this 2x2, clearly, I think it need a lack of focus on either. It makes you irrelevant. A sheer profit focus, or rather sheer purpose focus with no profit focus, is more like a foundation, right? On the other hand, a pure profit focus without a purpose is a money-making machine that actually will not sustain. So what we really need is purpose-driven organizations. Purpose-driven organizations. There are many examples. You hit upon the nice Unilever story. I think Starbucks is another example. I think the way they think about, and I'll comment on that later, but they think about literally embedding that into their sourcing, the way they run their stores. And I think closer to home, I think Tata's, you look at Dr. Reddy's, I think Good Health Can't Wait. I think it's an organization that believes more than just making money. I think you referred to this, Mahendra, earlier, but I think this is quite telling. If you look at this business roundtable in the US, many of you would have seen this on the Fortune cover. Apparently in the 90s, when they wrote their purpose statement, it said the purpose of business is only to make money. It literally said something like that. And now they have redefined, and you touched on the 5 elements, so I won't expand on that. But I think there's a real business case why we have to start thinking differently. I think we've done some research on long-term, more purpose-oriented organizations, and we find that these organizations, as opposed to others, serve their clients and customers better. They attract better talent. They have higher engagement scores. They actually have higher long-term return to shareholders, and they obviously make a better impact on society. I talked about long-term thinking, right? You look at, if you were to enter China as a multinational, it takes anywhere between 8 to 10 years to break even, right? I said earlier, 70 to 90% of the company's value is related to cash flows that are 3 years out. So if you're making decisions based on a 1-year time frame, whereas 80% of your value is dependent on cash flows year 4, 5, 6, there's a total disconnect there. In the US alone, we did some research, and our view is that short-termism is actually causing loss of about 5 million jobs. It's denting the GDP by about $1 trillion, and more than $1 trillion of asset value is being lost. That's the cost of the economy in the US of being short-term oriented. And as we research and we do this comparison between companies that we consider as exhibiting long-term behaviors with others, you can see the delta in their performance. Because ultimately, if you believe profit does also matter, which it should, you can see how purpose-driven organizations and those that have a long-term mindset on average deliver better economic profit. So finally, what to do? Just 3 thoughts. First is, I think many of you would have seen, this is not my thinking, this is borrowed from Simon Sinek, a well-known author, who talks about start with the why. You know, most of us in business, we can articulate what we do. You know, if you ask someone who makes bikes, they say, you know, we manufacture 2-wheelers or we manufacture 4-wheelers. You ask them, how do they do it? You know, they'll talk about how we do global sourcing, low-cost product development, really segment the market. You ask them, why do you do it? And you'll notice a lot of people will fumble to answer that question. And I think that's one of the reasons why this guy actually talks about Apple, and it's still a very successful company. And if you run into people at Apple, they actually don't believe they're making phones. They don't believe they're designing great products. They actually genuinely believe they're changing the world. Right? And I think that is a missionary purpose that some of these leading institutions have. Second, define your level of commitment. You see, at least to us, there are 3 levels of commitment one needs to think about. First is being a good corporate citizen. You know, corporate social responsibility has been a big buzzword in India, but that's frankly a very compliance mindset. I'm expected to do something, let me contribute some money to something, hopefully that keeps me out of trouble. Second is what I call more than that, it's best practice. So you see, how can I reduce, how can I be carbon neutral, how can I take minimize water wastage in my factory and this plant. But the holy grail is what I call next practice, where you embed doing good into every element of doing business. It is embedded into your value chain. It's embedded into how you procure. It's embedded into how you manufacture. It's embedded into how you sell. It's embedded into how you hire, how you engage. And that's what level 3 is. In the interest of time, I'll skip. I won't expand on that. But I think we all need to reflect. In our organizations, where are we? Are we level 1? Are we level 2? Are we aspiring to be level 3? And the problem with level 1 and 2, it's not, of course, it's a good starting point. But the issue is, it's flavor of the month. Typically, you have small pockets of excellence here and there, but it's not institutional. You know, follow through is lacking. And frankly, many of these things don't outlast the CEO. You know, whosoever is espousing them, the person goes, and many of these initiatives fall by the wayside. So level 3 is when it becomes institutional, right? It is not just a flavor of the month. It is embedded into everything we do and how we think about business. Some good examples of companies that I believe are aspiring to be at level 3. I think Starbucks, Unilever, in some ways I would say ITC. Lastly, what does it mean for us individually? I just leave with this thought. I think one is personalize. And if you're leading an organization, it has to be authentic. So you can't talk about an institutional purpose without talking about what it means for you personally and why do you care. Second, I think, is engage. I think the reality is that a lot of people in many organizations feel very disengaged. And I think no matter how we think, but leading by targets, numbers, performance alone is no longer enough. It's no longer inspiring for a lot of people. You think it might be inspiring, but it's not. So I think you have to engage about what gives you meaning and purpose. And finally, you have to reinforce. When people do things that you believe help meet your purpose, you have to reinforce. At a very personal level, I'll just close by saying, for me personally, in leading McKinsey, I think while we know what we do, how we do it, we've been on a journey ourselves on why we do what we do. And at least I think in India, we are clearly coming to the view that we have a very noble purpose in actually helping make a positive impact on those 1,500 leading institutions that will drive this country to being the 3rd largest economy in the world And that's what gives me meaning and purpose every morning to get up and say, what difference can we make? Because if we can make those leading institutions grow with consciousness and with a sense of purpose, I think it'll have a real impact on the country. So with that, I'd like to close, and thank you, Mahendra, for inviting me.